I knew I had to close a deal or else risk losing a lot more. I founded eSkill and we bootstrapped it for over 20 years and not take any more risk of growing slowly.
Were the buyers privy of your cash crunch against the lender?
The negotiation became hard. We walked away, took it to market again. Sometimes consider raising money or selling, not when you need to, but when you're looking really good.
What would be the negotiation tactic when it comes to selling your company that you would want to pass on for founders to consider or be very aware of when selling their company?
I think one of the best ways to bootstrap a company is to find...
Everyone, welcome back to $100 Million Exits. Today we have Eric Friedman on the show, founder of eSkill. Built the company for over 20 years and sold it last year after trying to sell it for over 3 different periods. Eric, I want to just jump in for our audience and kind of walk through why did you take the deal last year? And why did you take the deal with the Earnout?
Interesting. Great question. After bootstrapping 20 years of consistent growth, I become very comfortable that I could just keep on doing this. The product we were doing, which was skills testing for employers, I decided one day, I want to get a lot bigger than this. I want to become a behavioral testing company too. And I leaned pretty hard on our software development partner who had some of our equity. I still had the majority share of equity in my company, which was a nice luxury, to help finance that. And there came a time when their new ownership couldn't do that anymore. So all of a sudden, I had cash flow pressures I didn't have, an incomplete, potentially massive product, and working capital dried up, and interest payments to start making on what I had piled up. So our cash flow situation changed very quickly. And we were paying these bills, but that was getting in the way of growth. So at that moment, I realized it's best to sell the company, pay off this debt, and not take any more risk of growing slowly.
So there's a couple of things I want to add some color to, and I want to talk about the Earnout as well. For the sake of the audience that doesn't know, you had a development partner that was kind of like a dev shop that built a lot of the technology, so you didn't have to invest cash. They took equity, but they essentially sold, and their new ownership had a different agenda. And so what you thought was a certain thing, good relationship, good partnership, was kind of pulled out underneath you, and you had to act fast. So you kind of realized the market force. Walk us through kind of the realization you had when we sort of see those cards unfold and how that might impact your business strategically.
Sure. Well, I knew for a while when we're building out this bigger product, I would see every month, we are adding another $100,000, $200,000 to our obligation to our debt to the software development company, which had become a very substantial company. It seemed like to me they could absorb it. They had about a third of my company's equity. Their principals did. And in the end, this would all be worth it for everybody. But it went on longer than I thought. I didn't know enough in advance how much to budget, how long for sort of an open-ended project till it was done. So eventually I was told that I'm sorry, but the new owners of the software dev company are not willing to support this anymore. We're cutting off the working capital, and the amount that you have, you're going to have to start paying, some sort of significant interest on. So at that point, I realized that my comparatively luxurious position of being able to have, without other outside financial investors, this kind of support, which had helped our company grow over a long time, had dried up. And so that was new. And that's when I realized that we had to sell. I decided to go for a sale rather than raising money and trying to pay that off, because at that point it's become kind of complicated. I've been doing it a long time. So we found an investment bank in New York and ran the first of, let's say, 3 processes to find a good buyer.
Walk us through the decision on picking an investment bank. What did you do to pick the investment bank? I'll kind of add to it in a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question, because when you reach a certain level of size, say about 10 million in ARR or so, you start to draw attention from investment banks, and they start pitching you their business. And for a long time, I wasn't planning on selling, so I would talk to them, meet them. So much really, I felt, depends on the skill of the business development rep who works for them. Their ability to convince you that they have people at that bank who've worked on similar companies and have succeeded, and here's the track record of similar transactions they've done. And ultimately, that's sort of how I initially chose Leonis Partners. And in the end, I was very, very happy with their work for us. So it started with that. And then ultimately it comes to you gel with your lead banker, and they do a good job telling your story, and crunching all your data. The toughest job they have to do is take over your Salesforce data and other metrics, which are in format sometimes only your team knows, and quickly digest it, process it, and pitch it as best they can, most positive way.
What was your experience? Like, I imagine you said you met with multiple bankers. You always chose Leonis. What were some of the attributes that you liked and didn't like about some of them? What were some investment banks that were just like, clearly you didn't like, or they didn't get it, or didn't have the chops for you?
I think the biggest reason I would turn a bank down was that they seemed too small. Like some of them, it would be like almost like a one-man band, like at a larger bank, and they were the M&A guy. So it didn't seem like people would really take you that seriously. And then there are other banks that seemed they had a good name, people knew who they were, but then you'd be too small for them. They would talk to you, get your numbers, and say, "We're going to pass on this engagement." So in the end, Leonis had done a transaction, or one of the people on our team had done a transaction for a similar company to ours a few years before, not a conflict of interest. And he would have been on our team, and that was like, okay, that's fantastic. He knows our industry. He's ready to go.
Okay, that's good context. And then when it came to running 3 processes, imagine it wasn't your preference to run 3. So what happened there? Why did it lead to 3 processes? And what was that kind of the timeline from start to finish?
Okay, well, we started in 2022. This was in the fall of 22. Interest rates were still like really close to zero. Valuations on multiples were still very high historically. And so, we had very optimistic expectations of what we would get. How many tens of millions we would be getting for our company at a smaller size than we actually sold for. Our revenues were when we did sell. And we got an LOI that I thought was good. It was healthy. And around the time we were doing due diligence in the fall of 22, interest rates all of a sudden began surging 75 basis points a month.
Damn.
And so 45 days into all that, we checked in with the private equity buyer, and they came back with a 15% retrade. And they didn't say, "Oh, our cost of capital has gone up because of these interest rates, and that's causing us to adjust the valuation that we give your company." I would have been disappointed, but that would have made some sense. Instead, they came back with these very fuzzy assessments of risks. What's the risk that your head of revenue is going to leave your company and take all the customers, or the risk that these are all things they could have said on day one. So I kind of lost faith in their, this was a good faith, negotiation. And plus they wanted me to work for them for 5 years. And so I wasn't getting a great taste for this relationship. And because we've grown every year to that point and we are self-sustainable, we walked away. I didn't want to continue that conversation. But that's sort of also when we began to get a lot more cash flow pressure. So in 23, we had another buyer come to us, and not from the investment bankers, but someone who knew people in common. They gave us a pretty healthy LOI, not quite as much as the first one, but still pretty good. And we opened up our data room to them. And this was around December of 23. And they never went into it. So all of a sudden they kind of went poof. So we signed an exclusivity. We opened the data room. Now they didn't have committed capital. So one thing I understood, they had to go back to their backers to try to get, and when they finally unpoofed in January at some point, like, where have you guys been? I thought we were having holidays aside. They said, well, our backers want to see how you do over the next 3 quarters. And I said, okay, well, I'm really looking
20 years of business, you know how you're going to do.
One of the somewhat frustrations that I've had, in 20 years of eSkill, we've had tough years with headwinds. 2009 recession, we only grew 9% that year. COVID 2020, we only grew about 9% that year. 2021, we grew 28%. 2019, we grew 40%. So you look at the history of the company, we had a strong intellectual property advantage with like almost 1,000 skills tests. Some years are good, some years are bad. It doesn't mean the company is a rock star forever or a dog forever. But when you're getting evaluated for a sale, you're often only as good as your last 12 months. And that's what everything sort of hinges on, that one freeze frame of your growth. That was a little, I understood that they want to take the risk, but I kind of wish they'd said that up front. So that didn't happen. And bankers usually say, if you run a process and don't do a deal, don't keep shopping, because then you'll get shop worn. So just go away for about maybe 3 quarters, try to build your business, look good, and then come back on the market, which is what we did from 22 to 23 and then to 24. By 2024, it was extremely tight. Every month we had to sell and collect enough to pay all of our obligations, all of our vendors, of course, payroll, and the debt payments. So it was a very, very stressful time for me, and I knew I had to close a deal or else risk, losing a lot more.
Brutal. And that's all, that debt was all just that partner, right? There was no other debt, was there? Or was there other debt?
No, we didn't have any credit card debt. We had no debt. Now, look, the new owners of the software development partner we had were completely rational. So I might have been frustrated, but I can't blame them. They came in, they didn't have interest in my company. Their job was to have their new portfolio company do well and have good cash flow, not subsidize some special interest customer of theirs. So
that definitely makes sense. It's just tough. So out of curiosity, if you can share, you gave the step shop and then their partners a third of your company. But they were also kind of accumulating this debt against you. Were those two separate transactions or two separate value sets, or was that kind of like together? Like they were getting the equity interest, and are they converting their debt to equity at some point and then they stop converting? Like how did that kind of come apart?
Well, the early years of eSkill, we basically offered this dev shop, they started around the time we did. So they grew with us and they became a really big 9-figure a year business. They subsidized probably $1 million worth of software development in our earlier years. And so for that, I gave the principals of the company, equity. And it worked really well for a long time. Of course, they took on new majority owners. They had the equity, but the new owners had the control and they had no equity. So it was a tough position for the principals, but they couldn't do anything about it.
Well, looking back and, talking to other founders, because I deal with founders all the time and they consider dev shops as a way to kind of same problems, you solved with one and just kind of get to market a little bit faster. And you kind of get a little creative. You're not necessarily paying payroll. You have maybe some more flexibility in payment options. But looking back, would you have stuck with the dev shop or would you have considered hiring in-house?
Also a great question. Working with that dev shop, they were good, and we really gelled with the principals. For many years, that was the right solution. If I could live my life over again, I probably would have said, once the people who really were my partners no longer had control, at that point, we were a big enough software company. We should have had our own. We shouldn't be outsourcing software development anymore. The only reason we were doing it was because we were doing it with someone who had a strategic interest in us. When that goes away, it's much better, more cost-effective to hire directly.
Yeah. It's something I deal with all the time. I see founders, especially in the early days, hey, we got this dev shop. And it creates such an unknown, despite, employees can also be complete unknowns. But I've seen some deals unravel and or at least on the VC side, they don't amount to being able to raise money because VCs have seen this playbook roll out where dev shops cause more problems than good. But it's great to hear that this was the right dev shop and this was a good partnership, because sometimes it's not always the case. And that's, did you have a personal relationship with the partners beforehand?
No, only in the context of eSkill, but they were in some ways partners of my business. We got along very well. We shared the same vision for what eSkill could be. So I think one of the best ways to bootstrap a company is to find a dev partner who can grow with your company, that's the key part, because you'll always need software developers. And so you have someone who has a deep interest in seeing you do well, even more so than milking your monthly revenues. I think that can be a really good place where you outsource.
So what would you like? So there's some good attributes, but what would be some other attributes that you'd want to share with our audience to consider when partnering with a dev shop?
Well, if you've known in advance the kinds of things you're going to need, like eventually we needed to be SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. We need to be on Amazon Web Services. We needed to have single sign-on. So is this a dev shop that understands those roadmaps and has worked with similar? I mean, I didn't know this stuff back then. I'm lucky that they could grow with us, but knowing it again, especially if you're going to sign with someone as an equity partner, dev, do they know these concepts and do they know how to get there when the time comes?
So appreciate the insight there. I think it's good for founders who kind of know different ways to scale a business to an exit. And there's so much information out there frowned upon in terms of the VC world bringing on dev shops. And here you are proving a bootstrap use case as to kind of the pros and cons for founders to be aware of. But I want to take a step back and go back to the exit conversation. So we were last talking about you running 3 processes. You finally found your bidder that was going to take it home all the way. And you also kind of mentioned you chose the earnout. So by inferring from that conversation, you had multiple offers. So kind of walk us through the process that was run in terms of like, all right, you're in market. How long were you in market? How many people did you talk to? How many LOIs did you get? And we'll start there, and then I want to get into the details of the LOI.
Sure. Well, as the investment bankers run the process, usually it's about, in my experience, about 3 months. First, they engage either buyers that have already found you or new buyers that they've identified. This is after they've spent maybe 2 or 3 weeks with you, updating your Salesforce analysis, your marketing materials, your pitch deck, and things like that. So they pre-pitch maybe 20 to 30 different potential buyers. Some private equity, some are strategic. That was how it panned out. Then there'll be a subset of that, maybe say 15 or 20 that are interested. And then you sort of have a series, 2 or 3 a week, often, if not more, where the management team, me and my main executives, will have a presentation and a Q&A with these various buyers. And they'll ask all the questions they want to ask. When that's done, the bankers usually tell all the parties that are still in the game, okay, IOIs, indications of interest, which is a verbally conveyed valuation for your company, or LOIs. Well, IOIs are due this date, and then maybe a week after that, we want to see LOIs, which is a documented, more fleshed out version of your enterprise value they're going to pay and the large terms around that, like an earnout. So that whole process was about 3 months.
And how many parties did you have ultimately engaged in your process at the end?
We had, I'd say six IOIs, and 4 I thought were like a reasonable valuation, and 2 were just lowball.
And there's always the lowballs in there, and they always try to throw their hat in the ring, hoping no one else is at the party. And so what led it to you taking the earnout? Because you mentioned you had some maybe all cash options. What about this deal stood out to you to kind of take the risk with an earnout?
Okay. Also, like none of these deals were the deals I would have envisioned a few years before. They were all less than 2022, significantly. So, but at this point, my priority came, I need to close the deal. And this was a positive outcome. I mean, everyone's getting their money. So it was a positive outcome. I needed to make sure. So I went with the party that had done the most homework on our data prior to submitting their LOI. Because I had seen LOIs, it's like, go poof. LOIs came to mean very little to me. You can put any kind of valuation you want on an LOI. They sound great. Lock up a seller for an exclusive for 2 months. So that all other buyers are told to go away. And then you can readjust that offer whenever you want. So really the buyer has a lot of power in that moment. And I wanted to go with the one that had the least likelihood of a retrade and the least likelihood of just walking away, having experienced both of those. So that's the one we went with.
Real quick, if you're a founder doing over $5 million in revenue and want to know what the best $100 million plus founders are doing to fuel their growth, then make sure to subscribe to our $100 million exits newsletter. Get the playbooks that are proven on how to fund, grow, and sell your business. I'll even give you a curated list of investors that want to invest in your business. It's totally free. All you have to do is click that link down below. Subscribe, do it now. I promise it's worth it. You won't regret it. You got nothing to lose. Go ahead, subscribe now. Back to the show. And what would be your advice to founders that might consider, selling their company? What would be the things to be attentive to in this process, and maybe the terms to look out for, or the things that you thought would be useful to share?
Having seen a lot of, again, insubstantial offers and LOIs, I would really pay attention to, one, it might sound weird, the kindness of these buyers as you meet with them and as they ask questions. There's definitely a few different attitudes out there. Some people grill you like it's an interrogation. Of course, they want to learn about the company. They want to do their math. But you're probably going to be working with these people. Is this the kind of boss you want to have? Is this the kind of partner you want to have who is going to treat you like just a cog in the machine of making them and their limited partners money? Or do they engage you like someone, hey, I would love to work with you. And of course, we need to answer these questions. So tell me about it. So that's one. And then two, like I had said, our buyer did the most homework. They grilled my CFO, politely, grilled my CFO on every aspect of the P&L, and all the questions they had in our Salesforce data before they made their LOI. And that gave me a lot of confidence that, okay, they understood our business a lot better. So they're much more likely to stick to that valuation. And indeed, there was very modest retrade. They did what they said they were going to do in the time frame they said they were going to do it. And that was very impressive.
That is pretty meaningful. And it's amazing how sometimes some of these deals, as you said, like it gets exciting. You get these offers, and you're like, oh, it's going to happen. But then some of these buyers are either don't have the cash, or are fishing, or kind of want to come in at low balls, and or worse, lock you under exclusivity and don't kind of relinquish that control, and then they start retrading and changing the numbers, and then a lot can happen in 2-3 months, as you were kind of experiencing with your situation at that. Actually, let me ask you that: were the buyers privy of your cash crunch against the lender?
That's a great question. Yes, we were transparent about that. We didn't talk about it obsessive, but yes, they saw that we had this promissory note. They saw that we had a rising schedule of interest payments over time. So they knew we had pressure. But what they also, one of the things that happens when they buy our company, that debt gets paid off by the sellers, by us.
Yep.
So we suck that up. They acquire a debt-free company.
Yeah. So
from my point of view, that's a huge opportunity. It's totally unshackled from all the headwinds and things that may have been impeding our growth the last 2 years operation, and they can take it away.
No, it's a great value capture on their part for sure. But I was just curious,
they were aware.
Yeah. So,
so it didn't help our negotiating position, but what helped us is that we had multiple offers.
Yeah. Well, I would say that's one of the always key pieces. You got to have multiple parties at the table in order to keep anyone honest. And when it came to one thing I was going to say about that situation, with that cash crunch, that's often seen as a way for people to retrade after the fact of you got no other options. You can't go back to market. So it's great to see that this firm did not kind of put you in that predicament. But ultimately, you had an earnout. I know there's some things you can and cannot share, but enlighten the audience about your earnout to the degree that you can, and what would be your advice to founders when negotiating an earnout?
Okay, so earnouts, fair enough. You want to see how the company performs. Make sure that the metrics attached to the earnout are something that you've delivered before. In this case, the metrics attached to the earnout were well within, if you look at the past 5 years of the company's history, there were years we did that and better. There were years we did worse, but free of the debt, with no macroeconomic headwinds like COVID or a recession, I didn't see any reason that we could not have achieved, all those earnout growth figures. And it was all based on revenue growth for the most part.
Okay. And that's pretty fair. Like a revenue-based earnout is far more advisable than, say, a profit or an EBITDA line, because a lot of things can happen after to get to the bottom line.
Sure. So that's why I agreed to it. And again, I felt like these guys were the best chances I had of closing. And earnout or not, this is the deal I'm going to go for, rather than something that may have been a little more nebulous and where they might have said, hey, you want to say how you want to do over the next 2 or 3 quarters, or done a big retrade. I didn't sense that these guys were going to do that, and they didn't.
That's good. And what happened after that? So you agree on terms, you ran a 3-month process, you signed the LOI with these guys. How long till close, and then what did you do after close?
It was about 2 months, maybe 2.5. It's a little longer because our Salesforce data was fairly jumbled. We had set up Salesforce in an age, before that, when I think setting up Salesforce was a profession. So our salespeople set up the Salesforce to work on a day-to-day basis. So not every sale was categorized the exact consistent way. It could be hard to tell what's an ARR transaction versus a one-time transaction, things like that. So that required extra analysis to draw out. So that took another couple of weeks, but fair enough. But it was less than 3 months. It was 2.5 months where we had multiple sessions. One thing, we didn't do it in this one, but one piece of advice that I would definitely give that happened from the first process we did, we negotiated as part of the LOI that 45 days into the due diligence, the buyer would have to reiterate the price they're willing to pay. They couldn't wait till the very, very end and then, surprise, we're only going to pay half of what we said. So that's how we found out that first year that there was a 15% retrade that otherwise we wouldn't even have known about until we're even deeper into the process with them. So that's something I think is always worthwhile to try to negotiate.
That's a good negotiation tactic. Kind of force them to be honest to their price before the final hour after you drag everything out for so long. All right, so been 2.5 months, deal closes. What do you do to celebrate?
It's really funny. I was just so relieved to just not feel the stress of worrying if it's going to close, and making sure the company now had a future. The debt was paid. So everyone who had taken that risk and investment was paid off. So was a relief. Did I really celebrate? I don't think so. I went anywhere. But on a new subject, I knew during this process that I was not going to be the CEO anymore. The buyer was in a different state, and they wanted local C-suite executives. So they had someone that was in their inner circle this is going to be the CEO. It's like, fine, I've been doing it a long time. I don't know everything. Maybe these guys with their SaaS experience and playbook will do things with my company that I couldn't afford to do or didn't know to do. So that seemed fine. And that was part of so even though I accepted the earnout, I also said that I had no control anymore over the execution leading to the earnout.
And sharing what you can share. How's been that progress? Have you completely removed yourself from the business? Are you an advisor? Or are you just completely hands off? What's kind of been the role post acquisition?
Well, formally, I was invited to stay on for 3 months as a transition there. I didn't have much of a role during that time. And after that, that's pretty much it. It was really just if the new leadership occasionally had a question, they would ask, but nothing really substantial. So no, it was weird to sort of just all of a sudden, you go from running a company and meeting with the executive team multiple times a week to just nothing. And then you're a decent chunk of what you've spent all these years building is now in the hands of other people. And it's up to them if you get that earnout or not. And I'll mention that I know a handful of uh, SaaS product CEOs that sold their businesses. Sometimes they stayed CEO or at least of their unit. Earnouts are not common to get the earnout. I'm going to put it that way. So I think that if you get an earnout offer, you have to expect that you are most likely not going to see the earnout, and don't assume that you are. So factor that in.
I want you to keep going because I want you to explain this in more detail, because this is something that I believe in as well, is the idea of earnout, a slightly higher valuation, maybe a little carrot or sweetener on top sounds appealing, but the reality is it's the most litigious part of any transaction after post-transaction. So what else can you share from that perspective?
Well, some cases like ours, one of the offers that we got that would have been all up front came in after we had signed exclusivity. So part of me would have loved to said, you know what, that's the better offer. Let's do that. But I stuck to my word. I signed exclusivity, and I told that other buyer who had known us for a long time, they just were late with their LOI, that I'm sorry, it's too late. And we've signed this exclusivity, and as long as that stays on track, that's so in the end, sometimes that's the cost of, sticking to that. But, I don't know, maybe that other buyer would have not, there might have been a massive retrade. So I can't say that would have worked out perfectly at all. These guys who did buy us, they did follow through. We closed when they said we were going to close. Almost very, very modest retrade. That I can say very positively. I would advise anybody who, an earnout can either be at the same level as other deals that are all cash, or the earnout could be on top of that. Here's a bonus.
Mm-hmm.
In my case, it really wasn't a bonus. I would say that the earnout would have brought us to the same level as the other IOIs that we had gotten. So really, I had to evaluate this. This is part of the core deal. There's some risk attached to that. I would advise, people who are considering an earnout deal, ask the buyers, can you send me 2 CEOs that you've bought from, 2 owners you bought from, that if they had an earnout, got their earnout, and talk to them. And I didn't do that.
They probably can't answer that question.
They might not be able to, but I would ask, because I bet if they could, maybe they would say, well, we should at least talk to these 2 guys. I'd be curious what they have to say anyway. They did send me, I did get referrals. I spoke to the other people I was referred to, not about earnouts, but they had positive things to say. So I didn't really think about it. But I guess that's one thing I'd be a smart question to ask a buyers, if they could point to other instances where the seller took the risk and it worked out.
And you had a stake of what was the enterprise value, not the bonus. Because it's like, hey, if you hit these milestones, we'll pay more, which is kind of more of a performance incentive, which has its appeal. Versus, or I see other deals where there's a kind of like a holdback of 10 or 15%, which some is just a time lapse. So they're going to hold it for 12 months for any maybe litigation or lawsuits or exposure or risk that might be there. Or it's a part of an earnout where you have to, if you were hitting 30% year-over-year growth, then you got to hit 30% one more time, or whatever the number might be, or just not trade down, like not have a negative year. So it can always be negotiated on various different points, but being that you are no longer involved, you kind of, was it like a fade out, like it just became less and less relevant, or was it a like, thank you for your time, Eric, you can have a seat over there now?
It was like that. I mean, it was a very sharp. I think I had the 3 months of transition. And I think I was disconnected from the email system like the day before it ended. I mean, which is fine. That's got to be. That's because SOC 2 Type 2 security. You really have to comply with that. So I joke about it. It's perfectly legitimate. But it was a very much of a, thank you very much situation, and it's in new hands. But one thing I say, they kept almost my entire employee base of like 30 people or so. I mean, the C-suite changed over, but I take that as a compliment that they kept almost my entire staff.
And sometimes it's mission critical for founders selling their business because it's, especially if you've been building it for a long time, you build a relationship with these employees, they, committed to it, and you want to make sure they find a good home. And I've seen some founders take way less than they probably could have taken home in prioritization over other staff. So it's good to hear that you built a team that was not only worth keeping, but must keep. Because obviously, a lot of you guys want to cut whoever they can cut right away.
We had a lot of contractors. At that point, we're outsourcing to marketing agency. So marketing was outsourced. We'd gone back and forth over the years of having an in-house marketing team and an outsource to an agency. And that time, as you know, digital marketing has become so much more complex especially now with AI and AEO, as some people call it, SEO, community building, content leadership, thought leadership, that it's almost better to have a panel of fractional experts than 3 people who work inside your company are supposed to do it all. But I think where eSkill got cut the most was the outsourced partners in favor of bringing people in-house with a better margin and more control and transparency. And I can't say it's a bad idea. It really depends on your budget and experience for bringing those people in.
That makes sense. So, emails cut off. You're a free man. What have you been doing?
Well, aside from getting married for the first time in May and having a new child, I joined this wonderful group you know about, Post-Exit Founders, where we've a global community of really like giving and friendly, approachable people with all different levels of exit success, but the one common goal, we want to support each other and find exciting new things to work on together. Mostly that. And I have been working on a new startup, a hiring platform for the blue collar skilled trades. That's a separate conversation.
Yeah.
We definitely see a need for that. But I guess going back to eSkill, there's so much potential to grow. Talent assessment will never get old. Assessing someone's fitness for a job, skills fit, behavioral fit, aptitude fit. And we always have the biggest skills library, and there's 9-figure players in just the behavioral with a little bit of skills. That's the direction I was trying to take eSkill up until the time we sold the company. And I hope that we'll be very supportive of their new owners taking eSkill back in that direction. But it's more than a 1-year time frame of return. That's probably more like a 3-year and beyond time frame of return.
Well, it would hopefully be nice. Many years down the road, you get to look back and see eSkill still continuing to grow and be meaningful, and maybe still some of the original team there prospering from, something that you've been spent 20 plus years of your life building and operating. When it comes to advice that you'd want to give to a founder that maybe we haven't already discussed, when it comes to evaluating the opportunity to sell and just getting ready for an exit and just mentally preparing for that, what would be your advice to founders?
Going back to what I said earlier, that you're often judged only be as good as your last 12 months. Sometimes if you have a rock star year, you may not think, I don't need to raise money. I don't need to sell. This is going great. Well, I can almost guarantee there's going to be a year coming up that's not so rock star and very stressful. So my advice would be sometimes consider raising money or selling, not when you need to, but when you're looking really good. Because you can always, reap that outcome, find the new project, and start something new. Rather than waiting to see what'll happen next. Especially for bootstrapping. Especially if you don't have, a deep well of working capital or investor reserve to pull from, which I didn't. It worked well enough for a long time, but I think not having deep pocket investors at some point when I was taking larger and larger risks from an absolute dollar point of view, because, now you're a much larger company, you're running a lot more risk that you are going to fail and there'll be no one to bail you out.
I think it's fair advice, especially you had a bit of a hack with this partner coming in. They effectively took a third of the company. So effectively as if you raised money, they owe to some degree. And, a lot of companies that raise money, they'll go out and get debt or, continue to get other access to capital, and then they'll be pressured, in those situations. So I think, for a lot of companies, similar situation where it's, they can take into consideration these other options of raising capital, bootstrapping, debt, whatever it might be. But I think you found a pretty good solution with this debt. I mean, not debt, but the kind of equity partner on the dev shop side, especially when it's a good partnership. And it sounded like it was a gravy train that could have kept going until they had a great outcome themselves. And then they lost control of that.
Yeah. And if the proper thing would have done to simply at that point decouple as a partner, they can be your vendor, or you can find a different vendor that's more cost effective for your scale.
Yeah.
I think at that point, their average contract value and billing rates had gone way, way, way up more than a software company should be paying. But if you're like a large global company, like their clients would be, and if you're doing a specialized thing for them. So yeah, we should have at that point, one of our biggest competitors, one of those 9-figure competitors I was alluding to, they had bought an Indian software company. And so they hired all their engineers directly as employees in India. And that's about as good as it gets. As long as they're quality and you have good visibility of what they're doing, you're going to have the lowest rates, direct employment. Like that to me was a very impressive way of doing it. If you can maintain the right kind of hierarchies to control what they're doing. It's much cheaper than hiring here or even now in Europe.
I mean, just as talented in a lot of different ways if you were able to kind of have that culture advantage, overseas and everything. And so when it came, as a kind of parting advice, as you were just kind of mentioning, what would be the negotiation tactic when it comes to selling your company that you would want to pass on for founders to consider or be very aware of when selling their company?
Make sure your buyer really understands your business, understands your P&L, understands your customer data, understands your marketplace and your goals. One frustration I've seen is some buyers think they can slap the exact same SaaS playbook on anything that resembles a SaaS. No company is a SaaS. We are an assessment company. We're selling talent assessment, versus sort of like a find your own insurance rate kind of company. They both might deliver, but each one's going to have different customer needs, different customer types, price points. So sometimes you can't remove all the services. You need someone there to man phones, answer questions before someone will risk money on a product that's very mysterious to them. Like assessments can be very mysterious. I want to hold someone's hand, have them tell me it's going to be okay if you use assessment and test 10,000 people. You're not going to get sued, and it's going to be predictive of success. And if they don't have that hand to hold on to, they just might not buy the product as high of a conversion rate. Cheaper to have the service model there and have a better conversion rate than cut them as a cost, have your conversion rate drop, your customer acquisition costs go up, and then say, oh my God, this business is a failure. So there's nuances to every kind of company that I think you want to make sure the buyer understands and hopefully appreciates that.
Some great advice, Eric. I appreciate you sharing that. And for the audience that would want to learn more about you, your experience, or maybe what you're working on next in the blue collar space, what would be the best way for people to reach out to you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Just do a search for Eric Friedman and eSkill, eSkill, or Eric J. Friedman, letter J, @gmail.
Perfect. And if you guys like an intro, feel free to reach out to me and I can introduce you to Eric at any time. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show and just walking us through the details of negotiating your exit, dealing with earnouts, why you choose different paths over others, and what are those influencers that kind of influence those decisions. So thanks again for coming on and sharing your story.
No, thanks for letting me talk.
If you were inspired by today's episode, then go ahead, watch this next episode. Promise it's worth it. And if you really enjoyed this last episode and you want to connect with the guest I had on today, make sure to leave a comment down below telling me why you would like an intro to this guest, and I'll make it happen.